Welcome to Faith and Spirituality in a Time of Crisis. My name is Chris Fuller. I am the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Officer for St. Joseph's College in Maine. This is a series of conversations with theologians, philosophers, local faith leaders, and church officials on how to adapt spiritually to these challenging times. My guest with me for this episode is Andrew Rivas. Andrew is the Executive Director of the California Catholic Conference and has a long history of working with the church, both locally and nationally. So welcome, Andy.
Hello. Hi, Chris.
So, Andy, I wanted to have you on because you are the executive director that serves bishops that serve the largest Catholic community in the country. And so I thought first talk a little, here in Maine, as I explained to you, we have one diocese for the entire state. But many states have what they call a conference. Can you explain a little bit about what a Catholic conference is?
Yes. And let me start out by saying that Maine has a Catholic conference. And most states do. I believe we're now up to 44 states that have Catholic conferences. And the Catholic conference is, for the most part, created by the bishops of a state who have, in my case, endowed me with the ability to speak on their behalf to the state legislature, as well as to federal or congressional representatives in Washington, D.C. And our mandate is also to facilitate communications between the 12 dioceses and their different ministries. So we have a pretty large mandate. And we also oversee the certification of all of our Catholic schools within the 12 dioceses of the state of California.
Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a lot. I know I'm seeing a lot of news here in Maine about creative ways that people are trying to adapt to meet spiritual needs here. For example, drive-through confessions.
Right.
Almost drive-in. There was a story the other day about drive-in adoration. So people drove and parked in their cars, and the priest appeared in his window and showed the Eucharist in front of people. So as I said, you serve the largest Catholic community in the country. So what are some of the challenges you've been faced with in terms of trying to adapt to these circumstances we find ourselves in?
Well, the first thing I need to tell you is instead of saying community, we have to say communities.
Yeah,
because we have California has 12 dioceses within the state. I have a board of 12 bishops who are the 12 ordinaries of our diocese, 2 archdioceses, San Francisco and Los Angeles, with Los Angeles being the largest archdiocese in the United States and the 5th largest on the planet, with an estimated Catholic population of 5 million just in Los Angeles. So once the state started, once the governor, I should say, started issuing executive orders on how to deal with the current crisis, we have had 12 different responses to how we were doing that, and so right now I can tell you universally across all of our 12 dioceses, there are no public masses being offered in any of our parishes in California. However, some of our dioceses have gone further by actually shutting those buildings down, so they're closed totally. Most of the other dioceses are still trying to keep their parishes open to allow for adoration, to allow for people to come in and visit with pastors and come and pray. But with each executive order that's coming, each diocese reacts in its own way. So it's incremental as we move forward. So those stories you're hearing about drive-by confessions, that's happening in some parts of California. In other parts of California, people can go in and confess to their priest in pretty much the same way they have been doing. There are certain rules, like in some dioceses, the confession has to be outside and they have to be separated by at least 6 feet, that kind of social distancing guideline. So it varies, and it's always interesting trying to keep up with the changes that are coming.
Certainly. So you mentioned some of the examples that we both shared about drive-through confession or other social distancing measures. Have there been other things that different dioceses have been doing to try to meet spiritual needs of their various communities?
Well, it's interesting you phrase it that way because my bishops right now meet regularly by Zoom and discuss what they're doing. They share with one another and encourage each other to keep the church relevant in this crisis time. And one of the things that was said yesterday during their call was we need to stop our pastors from being so creative. Because the reality is that here in California, the number of confirmed cases is spiking. It's Los Angeles and San Francisco are two hot spots in terms of infections. So pastors, God bless them, have been very creative in how they can try and keep things relevant and in communication with parishioners. So there is a feeling now that we're moving closer because the governor's executive orders have not been, as they said, haven't had real teeth to them. They've been orders, but not legal. Nobody's been fined or arrested, that kind of thing. But if you've listened to Governor Newsom's executive orders or press conferences the last 2 days, they're getting more strict, and the bishops want to be ahead of that and don't want to put people in danger.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so at this point, they're asking their priests not to be so creative, to really use the social distancing guidelines as much as they can, and use technology like live streaming for any of their events as much as possible.
Yeah, so share with our viewers, I thought a very interesting and impressive statistic, which is you mentioned in another conversation that we were having elsewhere about the Rosary. There was an online Rosary, and what was the response to that?
That was the Archdiocese of Los Angeles that offered an online Rosary, and over 99,000 people logged on. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, our live streaming is astronomical in terms of the folks that are logging on and participating electronically.
So is there any conversation about, obviously, when we get through this, we want to return back to the ability to attend Mass, to say Rosary together, to go to adoration together, but have the challenges of this moment also perhaps sparked some conversation about how maybe to use technology, maybe other kinds of ways after this crisis ends?
Oh, right away that conversation began, and it began on an official level. Here in the state of California, all 12 of our dioceses have Catholic schools that had the capacity to distance learn right from the very beginning. So when our schools closed, they only closed physically. The students didn't miss a beat, or the teachers, I should say, didn't miss a beat in terms of starting to teach from the classroom without students coming. And the state of California, the governor's office called me directly and said that a significant portion of public schools in the state do not have that capacity, and they wanted to consult with us on how they could get their systems up and running as quickly as possible. So we've actually been in dialogue with the governor and several superintendents across the state to try and help them do that.
Oh, that's great. California, you also serve the most diverse, culturally diverse Catholic population in the country as well.
Yes.
So how have you also needed to adapt to also meet those particular needs within particular cultural frameworks, right? There's a diversity of each diocese, but there's also cultural diversity. And how have you worked to try to meet the needs of the different populations within those dioceses?
You are bringing up probably the most challenging aspect of what pastors and bishops are having to deal with at this time. Like in Southern California, what we say is that on any given Sunday, Mass is offered in 41 different languages. So we have had lots of challenges, and we still do, in terms of meeting the needs of the Filipino population, the Hispanic population, the Vietnamese population, who all have their traditions and how they do things. And this environment that we're in right now has really challenged some of that, and some to a great extent, has kind of put a stop to several of their traditions, and that's been painful to watch and to deal with, because people get very emotional about not being able to go to mass, not being able to say the rosary, not being able to meet like they usually do, because church is the great convener for a lot of these communities.
Mhm. Have you found, earlier we were talking about, like, say, the rosary as an example, people joining. Have you been able to find out if not just, say, people in Los Angeles have joined those rosaries, maybe people from other parts of the state or other parts of the country have joined those rosaries?
I'll have to ask, but I know when Los Angeles advertised, um, when they were saying, when the Archbishop would say the Rosary, it was through their local network. So I'm thinking it's mostly from folks in the Archdiocese, but I'm sure it did get beyond the borders. So I'll ask to see if they can put together some sort of breakdown.
Now, you mentioned the California governor's office coming to you guys to seek your assistance. Part of your role also is to advocate on behalf of the bishops to the state
Yeah.
legislature and at the federal level. Have you been doing any of that kind of work? What has been your work? What has your work been like in that role relative to both state and federal governments?
That has been probably the biggest increase of the workload I've had since we've been asked to work from home, because the orders, the shelter in place orders that we have here have caused our diocese to you know furlough people. Nobody's to my knowledge so far. The 12 bishops have encouraged all their networks not to lay anybody off, but they have had to cut back. And it's my understanding that when the public masses stopped, approximately 63% of the funding stream that the 12 dioceses had stopped. So it's still some money coming in, but for the most part, they've had to adjust. And part of that is to cut back the workload of employees and furlough people, furlough a good number, 100%. So it's been tough, but they've had to adjust. And because of that, I've had to work with our national folks out of Washington, D.C., and we're working with our California legislators as well and administrators, because federal money that might flow to those who are furloughed and laid off, there are certain restrictions for religious nonprofits that we have to overcome. So I've been working a lot to try to overcome those obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, is there anything that the Catholic community can do? Is there any kind of advocacy that they could take up in this regard in support of the church's efforts?
Well, this past week, with the passage of the third emergency relief bill that came out of Washington, D.C., we have been asking our networks to make calls to the White House and to key legislators to help with the overcoming some of those obstacles and allowing religious nonprofits and nonprofits in general to access some of the emergency relief funds that are generally prohibited. That was pretty successful. In fact, we were told by our USCCB staff that our efforts were so successful that President Trump specifically asked the Catholics to stop calling. That he was going to help us as much as he could, and we've been getting good feedback that we're going to hopefully get most of what we're asking for.
And then that will be funneled through the state then to workers. The church won't have any particular role in that regard, correct? Just
Well, yeah,
it's more advocacy than it is distribution. Right?
Yeah, well, that's this another hurdle that we have to deal with, because here in California, the state will be administering a lot of these funds, and we have to make sure that the regulations that are encouraged at the federal level flow through down to the state level. And so that's another group of lobbying we will be doing for the state of California specifically.
Now, the Catholic Church provides the largest amount of social services probably in the world, right?
Yes.
And I'm guessing here in the United States as well. How have they been impacted by this in California? California, again, being the largest community, how has that been? How have the services of the church to the needy, the poor, been impacted by this. And is there anything people can do, again, to offer support in those efforts?
Yes, they can go to their local Catholic Charities offices and ask what is needed. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's material goods like diapers, hand sanitizers, all kinds of clothes, that kind of stuff. But Catholic Charities and St. Vincent de Paul are two of the largest social service providers within the church network, and they've been greatly impacted. Like I said, the diocese have had to look at how to cut back on their overhead to try and weather this storm. And I know that several Catholic Charities offices have cut back. I'm hearing, and I was just on with the Catholic Charities director for the state of California this morning, and they're trying to find out what the different dioceses are still doing and where they need the help. And what they're hearing is that even though some people have been furloughed and their workload cut back, they're still doing the same work. They're now volunteering their time. So I would greatly encourage folks to check with your local Catholic Charities and St. Vincent de Paul offices and see what they need.
And so we'll, I think at the end of this video, then I'll post a link to maybe the National Catholic Charities. People under that, I guess, could probably find them their local office, as well as St. Vincent de Paul.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope that's happening. Here, I was just talking to folks in California.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's end our conversation. I thought I'd end our conversation with what has been, in spite of all the challenges with regard to spiritual services, the challenges with regard to employment, what has been the bishop's kind of general message to their communities in light of all this? I mean, how have they been able to draw upon the Catholic tradition in terms of the ministry they're also providing to their community?
Oh, through all sorts of different ways. There's the constant talk of that the church has faced crises in the past. Communities have gone through great suffering in the past, and we as Catholics have a tradition and a way of dealing with that, with our spirituality, with our feeling of communio, of community. And it's been kind of comforting to listen to them talk about this. I mean, they're actively talking about, well, how do we minister to the dying in these situations? And hearing them talk about the rules that have been in place for a long time for infectious diseases. They can still give the anointings, they can still give the blessings, but they use cotton swabs, or they use Q-tips. There are ways of doing it. They can still minister to folks. There's still baptisms. There's still the sacraments that are available, and hopefully will still be available, that are still out there. And the bishops are also talking about, how does the church and its community come out of this crisis once it's been lifted? What is the plan that we will have in place? And right now we're talking about that actively with our local parishes and pastors to figure out how to move forward once everything is lifted. And that gives me a great deal of hope, and I'm sure others as they listen into those conversations.
You know what? This is the third conversation I've had now where towards the end of it, the person I'm speaking with ends with a note of hope. So I think that's a great place to end our conversation. So Andy, once again, I thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for all your work on behalf of the church. I know there's challenging times ahead, but I wish you all the best.
That's very kind. Thank you. Take care.